I have good news for some of you and bad news for others. For those Victorians who feel overtaxed, overregulated, and are generally just over the way that government interferes in their lives, I bring great news. The Libertarians have arrived. But for those of you who feel entitled to other people's money or would like to meddle in private lives, impose taxes, police thoughts, censor others, or who could be described as nanny statists, champagne socialists, rent-seeking fat cats, moral guardians, human red tape dispensers, or any other variety of authoritarian, I have terrible news. The Libertarians have arrived.
There you go. I really enjoyed that, and the Libertarians have arrived. So let's talk a bit about, so you represent the Liberal Democrat Party.
Yes.
Which provides a platform for, I would say, libertarians and classical liberals. Why don't you introduce kind of the party and what you guys are standing for?
Yeah. So the Liberal Democrats was formed back in 2001, so we're almost 20 years old now. And we're sort of based around a philosophy of liberalism. And for those that aren't familiar with it, it's actually pretty simple. And the basic idea is that the government the only place where government should really be interfering in people's lives is where they're harming other people. And that's sort of a general principle. And, you know, there's a whole lot of philosophy and everything around, you know, what libertarianism is and, you know, what that means. But, I mean, to me, what it really means is that anyone that thinks that government is doing too much and should maybe be doing a bit less than what it's doing now, they're sort of aligned with us in a way. So, you know, we generally feel that the government does too much and sticks its fingers in too many different things, and we want to wind back control of government over people's lives is our main.
Well, in your speech, you even did reference John Stuart Mill,
yes.
a favourite of the show. But what kind of led you personally towards libertarianism? Because I think a lot of people really associate libertarianism like mainly with economics, and it definitely does have that economic aspect to it. But it seems like you're also really proud of kind of that moral platform that libertarianism provides. So what led you towards libertarianism in particular?
Yeah, so like just about everyone in Australia who identifies as libertarian didn't start that way. They come from somewhere else. And in my case, I actually came from the left. So
really?
Yeah, so it's you know, I was always interested in things like freedom of speech, drug law reform, and these social issues. But later on, I started looking at, you know, economic issues, and I realised that the economic and social issues really are the same thing. They're all about governments taking control over people's lives. And when we talk about economics, what we're really talking, you know, people talk about money and stuff, but what economics really is to me is the actions that people take when they deal with each other and when they cooperate with each other. These are economic actions. And so I found it more and more difficult to separate these ideas. And I read a book by a guy called Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State and Utopia. And I didn't agree with some of the things in it, but one of the things that it did convince me of is the idea of just and consensual transactions. So the idea that people come to a consensual agreement with each other, and then, you know, they exchange money or ideas or whatever it might be, and that this is a morally just thing to do. And that led to a whole bunch of thinking around, you know, what was my current political beliefs and that sort of thing, and eventually led me down the path to where I am now. I actually wasn't politically active until quite recently, though. You know, I got to a stage in my life where I sort of found myself complaining about government and stuff, and
easy to do.
Like people, you know, lots of people complain, right? But then I thought, well, I don't want to be that sort of person that just complains about stuff. So maybe, I want to do something positive rather than just be negative. And so that's when I started, reaching out to people and meeting people, and I got involved with the Liberal Democrats. And then pretty much straight away, so this was in 2014, I started getting involved. I signed up probably a couple of years before that, but I'd never really got involved in anything. And then within a matter of months, I was a candidate for a state election, which was terrifying. But, I learned a lot. I learned about how politics really works and how, how to express ideas and debate ideas and that sort of thing. And then I ran as a candidate again, as a number 2 candidate for the Senate in the 2016 federal election, and then ran again in 2018 federal state election. And the rest is history, I suppose. So the Liberal Democrats were very successful in the last Victorian election. We got 2 candidates elected. We've also got another member that was elected in, I think, 2017 in West Australia. So we've got 3 elected members at the moment. Yeah.
Well, congratulations on your election. So what can, realistically, what can you kind of hope to achieve with kind of 2 members in the Victorian upper house? What can a party with 2 votes be looking to do?
Yeah, so look, there's a lot, I think. So in the Victorian upper house, it's, the government only needs 3 votes to get legislation through, and the upper house is quite unusual in that the size of the crossbench is huge. It's actually 11 members, lots of different parties. It's actually
what's the crossbench? I always hear it, but I actually never knew what it was.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sort of assuming things. So, okay, so in the upper house, in Victoria, there's 40 members, and the government needs 21, so they need a majority to pass legislation. Yeah. And so the government has 18 members. The opposition, which is the Liberal and National Party, they have 11 members. And then there's this very large crossbench of 11 members. And this includes parties such as us, the Greens, Shooters, Farmers and Fishers Party, Animal Justice Party, a whole range of different parties with different views on things. So, some of them are sort of single issue parties, others have different philosophical beliefs, but they need 3 members from the crossbench to pass legislation. So, it's pretty easy for the government to get 3 members to pass legislation, but the sorts of things that we can do is we can change the discussion around things. So we've got a platform where we can talk about different ideas, and that's a really good thing. We can also get involved in committee work. So I'm on 2 different committees. One's the Environment and Planning Committee, and the other one, which I recently just got elected to, is the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, which is a very high-profile committee, and I've only just started work in that. So, but
I definitely want to talk about both of them and also drug reform as well throughout the interview. But let's start with the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee. I mean, it sounds like a very boring name, but I assume it's quite important. What does it actually do?
Yeah, so this is a standing committee that contains upper and lower house members, and it gets the opportunity to query both the Premier, ministers and senior public servants about their actions related to the budget primarily. However, with the coronavirus, the pandemic situation at the moment, what the Premier has done is written a letter to the committee asking them to set up an inquiry to scrutinise the government's actions. Now, scrutiny of government action is something that's very important to me and very important to lots of other people, but also very important to our philosophy. And so there was the government agreed to add 1 extra member to the committee. And so what happened was there was actually an election amongst the crossbench to decide who would actually do that. There was a few people that wanted to do it, and I got elected to go on it. So That's going to be a really high-profile inquiry. We've already started work with initial meetings and scheduling and stuff like that. But I think what's going to happen is over the next few weeks, there'll be a series of public hearings, senior bureaucrats, senior and politicians and ministers and probably community groups and peak industry bodies and things like that will all present evidence of what's been going on, and we get an opportunity to ask them questions. So yeah, that's a pretty high profile thing.
Well, I mean, as a Liberal Democrat and kind of libertarian thinker, this is exactly the type of situation that you guys would probably be worried about in terms of like a pretext for like a government extending their control over citizens in this public health crisis. And what's your reaction when you see like lockdown measures and isolation measures being enforced with like $1,000 fines? And how do you think the government should be handling the COVID crisis?
It's actually higher than $1,000 in Victoria. It's $1,653 or something in Victoria.
And sorry. I know I asked you a question and I'm going to cut you off. But one thing I always like to highlight when government either, decides that something is like a criminal offence or you can fine someone, like to actually think about what a fine is, right? If you get, let's say, $1,000 fine and you're an average person making $25 an hour, that's literally 40 hours you're enslaved to the government. And the reason I say enslaved is because if you don't pay it, you're going to get a guy with a gun who shows up to your door and puts you in handcuffs. And that seems like a relatively good definition of enslaved to something to me. And so what that means, it's not even a judgment per se on the individual issue, but it's an understanding of what the actual fine is, and such that you need to be cognizant of like the level of servitude which you're putting average people through when you just throw out these numbers like $1,000 fines or $1,600 fines, whatever they are. And we need to understand that before we start supporting, these kind of safety measures.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're absolutely right that all fines are backed up by the threat of jail, right? I mean, if you don't pay a fine or continue to conduct the activity that you're getting fined for, it's always backed up by someone dragging you away and locking you up. Otherwise, it wouldn't have any effect. And you're also dead right in that taking someone's money is sort of, in a way, taking part of their life, because it's taking part of their past, I suppose, is the way I view it, because you've worked in the past to earn that money. And, depending on your hourly wage or how wealthy you are, I mean, that's a whole other issue of how equitable these fines are. But even to people well off, $1,600 is quite a large fine to anyone. Like it's a large sum of money. And so with the government's response, I mean, back to John Stuart Mill again, that's probably a bit of a theme, but where the idea is that the only valid restriction on liberty from government is to protect other people from harm. And so I've said in Parliament that I do accept that some of these measures may be necessary to protect people from harm, from harming each other. Where I've had problems is with some of the approach, and I feel that some of the restrictions don't meet that definition. So things like in Victoria, you still can't go fishing, for example. And I know it seems like a trivial thing to people. They say, oh, well, it's just fishing or whatever. But we shouldn't, governments shouldn't be placing values or rating the individual liberties of people, I think. And I brought this up in Parliament in the debate last week, that the government sort of trivialised people complaining because they couldn't go fishing or hunting or golf or whatever, and just sort of shut up and stop whinging sort of thing. But this is an essential thing for people, to maintain their marriage, for example. Like the husband, it's a stereotypical thing, but the husband will go out, spend some time alone fishing or doing whatever he does, and then they come back to the parents, the husband and wife come back together, and it's like a beneficial thing for their marriage. So it's like a really important thing to some people. and a lot of people use it to actually get food, fishing. So I just feel that the way that they trivialised it, it really rubbed me the wrong way. And some of the ways that they've been policing it, like this really heavy-handed policing, throwing around these fines and stuff, when I really think the police could have been more used as like guidance for these things. I don't know why a fine was sort of the first resort. They certainly didn't do that in some other states. Like West Australia left the beaches open and the police were down the beach, and they were just sort of monitoring what was going on. And if, they were congregating in large groups, they just went and had a word to them. And the police actually showed some footage from the beach in West Australia, like drone footage, and they showed it at the ground level, and it looked like everyone was close together. And then the drone went up and you could see from the air. Now, I don't like the police using drones to look at people on the beach, but in this case, they were showing it to show how well spaced apart they were and how they were doing a great job. And right. I thought, that was a totally different approach to Victoria, where we just shut down the beaches, and anyone that went down there, that, they'd go and throw a fine at you. And so there were some things that clearly weren't breaching the harm principle that people were getting in trouble for. And some of the things I question the evidence that they used for these restrictions, like schools is one that I'm pretty concerned about, shutting down the schools for so long and keeping children essentially under house arrest for long periods of time. I'm very concerned about the damage that might be doing, and Victoria's still got the schools shut. So, yeah.
Well, let's talk about the kind of nuclear prohibition in Victoria and the work you've done. Now, Australia is, as far as I'm aware, one of the big exporters of uranium to other countries. But do we have nuclear power in Australia or not? No,
we don't. So you're right. Yeah, you're dead right. Australia is a huge exporter of uranium. We mine it at a few different places in Australia, and we do some small-scale processing, and then we send it to lots of different countries, and we do that very well. We do have a nuclear reactor in Sydney, the Opal reactor at Lucas Heights. That's been operating for a very long time. Well, it was a HIFAR reactor, I think, before that. But anyway, we've got a reactor there. They use that primarily for research and medical isotope production. So lots of medicine uses nuclear isotopes, radioisotopes. So, I think the statistic was something like 1 in 2 Australians is going to use at some stage in their life medicine that was produced at the nuclear reactor in Sydney. So it's like a really critical part of our health system. But yes, you're right, we don't produce electricity with nuclear. Now, for me, this was something that I used to be anti-nuclear. I didn't like nuclear energy. And one thing that changed my mind, surprisingly, was the Fukushima disaster. And I had a very strong interest in that at the time. My wife is from Japan. I used to live in Japan.
You speak Japanese too, right?
Sorry?
You speak Japanese too, right?
Yes, yeah, I speak Japanese as well.
Nice.
But of course I was worried, right? And I studied physics at university, but I knew about radiation and stuff, but I didn't really understand what the danger was. And so I was concerned about my friends. So I started researching, what's the real danger here? And I ended up coming to the conclusion that there wasn't really a lot of danger. And when I did find out eventually, like how many people actually died from radiation in Fukushima, well, no one did. And so that just totally threw my thinking on the whole issue and made me rethink it and started researching a bit more, and actually found out nuclear energy is actually the safest form of energy production that you can get. And it actually uses less resources than just about anything, produces tiny amounts of waste, and it's the only form of energy production where waste is totally managed. And that led me to believe that it should be something that we should explore. And I was very clear on this right from when I got elected, which is why I wanted to get on the Environment and Planning Committee. And it's also why I worked very hard to get an inquiry up. So back in 1983 in Victoria, we instituted some a prohibition on what we call nuclear activities, which includes nuclear reactors, but also includes a whole bunch of other things such as processing materials and everything, basically everything except nuclear medicine is prohibited in Victoria. Some other states, that's not the case. And the inquiry is looking into those prohibitions and whether they're still something that is relevant in 2020.
So why do you think it's prohibited now? Like, what's the argument against it?
Well, the original reason why it was prohibited was around fears of nuclear proliferation, which have turned out to, like nuclear weapons, which has turned out to be sort of not really an issue. Australia manages our uranium exports very well, and the types of processing that you would do for a nuclear power plant are quite different to what you would use for weapons. So I don't really think that's an issue. A lot of it was just around fear in the Cold War. Everyone associated nuclear anything with nuclear warfare. And I grew up during the Cold War, which is, and everyone who grew up during that time sort of had this image of, now young people worry about climate change, but back then we were worried about nuclear annihilation, right? The apocalypse from nuclear war, and it was a real thing, right? We had superpowers, we had the Soviet Union and America, both with enough weapons to destroy everyone on the planet. And, they got pretty close a few times to going at it with each other. And so, anything nuclear was bad, right? And I think the arguments against it now, people talk about, cost is the biggest one that's come out of it. Actually, not many people are arguing about the safety so much. They're saying, well, it's expensive, which seems like a crazy reason to prohibit something. But yeah, it's because, wind power used to be really expensive too. So
yeah. Well, I think it is quite interesting. There might be some comparisons between like coal and nuclear. I mean, I was thinking in my mind, like, we have the prohibition because for whatever reason, but we're still happy to export it. Like, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, particularly for like if it's environmental reasons, like, why are we still happy to export it? Like, it's still going to get into the environment in wherever. And that's the same thing with coal. Like, if you're really worried about climate, like I always say I do not know about climate change because I always hear conflicting sides. But I mean, if pricing, electricity price in Australia is so expensive, in my understanding, because of a lot of the regulations placed on fossil fuels, like coal, for example. But we still export heaps of it to China. So when I lived in China, I could sit in my little Chinese bedroom and have the aircon on the whole time for basically no cost. And they're making that often with Australian coal. So it seems like maybe it might be the smart idea to actually make use of the energy potentially in Australia instead of just exporting it so other countries can benefit from it.
Yeah, well, it's very hypocritical, I think, to, not use nuclear energy ourselves, and yet we export such a huge amount. Like, an interesting fact that lots of people don't know, and you can look this up yourself on DFAT's website, but basically the amount of uranium that Australia exports every year is equivalent, approximately, it's about 97% of Australia's total electricity production. So if you think about what that actually means, it means that we're exporting zero carbon energy equivalent to our entire electricity production. So, when people talk about how awful Australia is with our carbon emissions and stuff, they never seem to talk about this amazing thing that we're doing with uranium exports and zero carbon energy production. So, I am concerned about climate change, and I do think we need to take action, but I think it's very hypocritical to say that we're in some, climate emergency, and yet we don't want to consider one of the most reliable and safest zero carbon energy sources in the world, which is nuclear energy. So it just seems very hypocritical to me.
I think Mark Latham is doing some similar things in the New South Wales government, trying to push
Yes.
for nuclear energy. But
Yes.
it remind me, I'm not. I think was it Victoria that had a few blackouts because of the reliance on like green energy.
Yeah, well, Victoria has had blackouts, and well, the reasons for the blackouts are many and varied. But yeah, South Australia's had blackouts too.
It might have been South Australia.
Yeah, no, but Victoria's had blackouts as well, and part of it is due to the fact that we've been subsidising this massive expansion in renewable energy, but we don't really have the transmission infrastructure and storage infrastructure to deal with it very well. And so we've got this crazy situation now where we've got these new solar farms that have been set up in northern Victoria, and they have to cut half of their output and basically just not use it because the transmission infrastructure can't handle the load, which is crazy. And because everyone's hating on coal, you know, most of our power actually comes from the Latrobe Valley with the coal power stations, but no one wants to invest in it. So we've got this really aging infrastructure that the government's sort of really put everyone off putting money into. And so you've got these really old power stations that require, you know, more maintenance and breakdowns and stuff. And so what I've been talking about, what not just me, others have been talking about, is we should be replacing that coal infrastructure with nuclear technology, or at least look at the idea, for God's sake, you know, at least consider it. And one of the really interesting things is one of the groups that's really keen on nuclear energy in the Latrobe Valley was actually the CFMEU. They put in a submission to the inquiry, very detailed and technically excellent submission on, you know, how we might be able to go about setting up things in the Latrobe Valley. And they're hurting at the moment. Like, I mean, they've had all sorts of economic issues out there. So they've got really high unemployment rates, and a lot of the workforce out there work at the power stations, at the coal power stations. And, you know, from a worker's point of view, if they've got some new high-tech industry that's going to be really long-term, high-tech, well-paying jobs like a nuclear power plant, you can sort of totally understand how that's very attractive to them. And, you know, it will help with pollution and all sorts of other things. So there's a lot of people out there that are really keen on it, and they're not, you know, they're not all libertarians and conservatives. You know, this is from the CFMEU. I mean, this is union, and another union, Australian Workers Union, they put in a submission that was very keen on the idea as well. So, you know, this is not a left-right issue. There's a lot of people on both sides of politics that quietly support this. I mean, even Bob Hawke came out, you know, a few years ago before he passed away. He's very supportive of developing nuclear in Australia and copped a lot of heat for saying that publicly, but yeah, he did it. So, you know, and his whole rationale was, you know, we need to do something about climate change, and yeah.
Well, is there like a kind of vague timeline where you might be able to kind of see some results from this nuclear inquiry?
Yeah, so the inquiry's been delayed because of the coronavirus thing, so we haven't been having public hearings, but the committee will, I think we're going to meet again next week, and I think probably we'll end up having to transition a lot of the work to, you know, Zoom meetings like what we're having now to, you know, we can do committee hearings like that. So there's no reason that we can't just continue remotely. Probably later in the year, we'll get a report done. I don't know the exact timelines because of the disruption, but sometime later in the year. So there's been a bunch of submissions, a lot of submissions in support, a lot of submissions against it. There's still a lot of people that don't like the idea of nuclear energy. The people that don't like it, surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly when you think about it, a lot of young people didn't grow up with this Cold War sort of idea of, you know, everything nuclear is bad. In fact, they don't know anything about nuclear. They've never been educated about it. They know nothing about it, and they're surprisingly open-minded about it. And So there's been a lot of young people that are curious about nuclear energy and what the possibilities might be. There's some people that are sort of hell-bent on this 100% renewables idea, and they just don't want to consider anything else. They just consider it, one of the comments that's been coming in the submissions is, it's a distraction from what we've really got to do. I don't see looking at technology options as a distraction, though. I think it's critical for us to look at these things. And there's also people who, have opposed anything nuclear for a long time and continue to oppose it. There's not a lot of new opposition to nuclear energy, though. Most of the people against it have been against it for a long time, I think. And younger people are pretty open-minded about it. I actually went to a climate change rally and we were handing out flyers about nuclear, and we got a little bit of hate. We had to sort of sack up a bit to turn up there. You can imagine that, but that were quite interested and engaged, and basically, most of the younger people were pretty open-minded about it, and a few of the older people weren't so open-minded about it. So,
well, I can imagine it might be a similar spread on drug decriminalisation. And in your maiden speech, you talked about, so your inaugural speech, I get it mixed up. You talked about that the war on drugs has failed, and that we need to move towards a new policy. And I'm very much inclined to agree with you. I mean, when I had a chat with Mark Latham, that was one of the sticking points we had.
Yes. But I've actually debated this with Mark Latham on radio before, interestingly.
Oh, have you? Well, it's good.
Yeah,
I like
that's one area where we disagree strongly, but we both agree pretty much on nuclear, though, I think. So
yeah. Well, can I ask, before we get into kind of that discussion, is there any like nervousness or tension, like as far as being perceived as a politician and come out like in more supportive of, not even supportive of drugs, but associated with drugs in ways that like other politicians are not? Are you a bit nervous about your public image in that sense?
No, not really. It's unusual that politicians are that open about talking about drugs, but as I said, I've been interested in drug law reform for a long time, and it's something that I think people talk about, drugs and drug law reform as if people are trying to promote drugs, and that's absolutely not the case with me and many other people who are interested in drug law reform. What I think I said this in my inaugural speech, and I've said it many times, is that we need to look at not just the harm from drugs, but the harms from prohibition itself, the harm from drug prohibition. And it's clear to me, I feel like we're on the right side of history. If you look at what happened with alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, right? You had organised crime take over. You had people dropping dead because of adulterated whiskies and stuff. You had this is another thing that people forget, you had all of the weaker alcohols like beer just disappeared from the market, because for a smuggler and a criminal, it's easier to smuggle smaller amounts of high potency stuff than large amounts of low potency stuff. And, you've had people, because it's all black market, the only way of dealing with disputes is through violence, as with all black markets. And so you saw organised crime run out of control, people dropping dead. And guess what? We got the same thing now with drug prohibition in Victoria, right? You may have heard about this Lawyer X thing, with this whole issue with the justice system. So in Victoria, there was a problem with, we've had a drug, like a organised crime war, the gang wars for decades in Victoria, people getting shot and all sorts of stuff. And this Lawyer X saga where a lawyer was recruited. She was actually representing organised criminal, but also was recruited as an informer by the police, and it's led to this big royal commission and like all of these problems that you see with corruption of the system, massive expenditure on corrections, all sorts of issues with adulterated drugs and things like that. The root cause of all of that really is drug prohibition. Now, you know, what's the right approach going forward? I mean, we've spoken a lot about cannabis legalization. I think that's just a matter of time, right? It's not a theoretical thing that you talk about anymore. It's something where you can point to other countries that have done it. In the US, lots of states have started that process.
One of the videos I looked at for the interview is, you might have seen it as well, a segment on Sky News on Paul Murray Live, which talked about you and your inaugural speech and the drug prohibition content. And on there was Johnny Ruddick, who's a friend of the show a little bit, who loved what you said and thought you were totally right. But there were also kind of two conservative commentators on there who kind of had these, I would regard as vague oppositions, saying that like a drug taking society is not a strong society or something like that.
Yeah.
And so
I remember that.
And so it doesn't necessarily seem clear to me that it's just going to happen. Like I would love to see it happen, but I also feel like if I was kind of a hippie in the 70s, I would have thought it was only a matter of time there. What do you think actually needs to kind of happen? Well, before we even get to the actual drug reform, let's talk about what we actually think needs to kind of be done. You pointed to Portugal, which decriminalized everything, not just like marijuana, but I think like even heroin, like cocaine, harder drugs. And they actually saw much better social outcomes. Would you be, in terms of kind of going forward, looking at kind of just marijuana, or would you be trying to look at like a more wider variety of drug decriminalization?
Yeah, so drug law reform, there's lots of different angles, right? And I think one thing that people often confuse is the difference between decriminalization and legalization, right? Decriminalization just means that you're not going to penalize drug users with criminal sanctions. Legalization is where you allow trade in certain drugs. Now, I think there's scope for both of those things, and it sort of depends a lot on the substance itself. In the case of cannabis, I think that it's quite clear that, you know, legalization is a definite possibility. People talk about the harms of these drugs, and I don't dispute that even cannabis itself has harm, but the prohibition causes harm too, and this is what people need to start discussing more, and I think people are becoming more aware of that. And we want to attack organised crime, really, and cannabis is a massive earner for organised crime networks, and this is what I think is changing. And this is, you know, it used to be seen as sort of, you know, like you said, like a hippie sort of thing, but actually, you know, your law and order people who've been saying, you know, we've got to get tough on drugs and blah blah blah. You got to say, well, you know, it hasn't worked so far. Like we can totally undercut organised crime by using the power of economics, right? Just by taking away their market and legalising it. And we can do that with cannabis, and they've done it overseas, right? It's not like we're revolutionaries doing anything here. It's happening all over the world. It's happened well, they've been doing it in Europe for a long time, but America's doing it, Canada's doing it. I think New Zealand's looking at it as well. So for cannabis, I think it's just going to be a matter of time, I hope. But, you know, it's going to require work too. It's not just going to happen by itself. It's going to need people like me and others pushing the idea.
I mean, one of the funny things I realised kind of as I grew up was kind of like the amount of adults who take drugs recreationally. It's actually quite a lot of people. I mean, particularly I would say if you look in like the corporate world and you're at like a corporate party or you've got a deal that you need to be staying up for. I mean, I'd be very surprised if, you know, you work on finalising a mergers and acquisition deal or something, and everyone's just drinking Coke to stay awake.
Yeah.
But I kind of think that and this is where I'm kind of conflicted in some sense, right? Because I kind of think it all should be decriminalised, partly because of the Portugal stuff, but also I don't think I should get in trouble for having a few grams of marijuana in my pocket, where I'm going to go home and have a fun night watching Lord of the Rings with my buddies, right? And at the same time, I don't think. I think if you want to be working on a corporate deal and you want to do cocaine, I actually don't care that much about that, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. But in terms of what to actually do, it might be better just to focus on how marijuana is not going to hurt anyone, kind of, and do it piece by piece. I don't know.
Yeah, look, I mean, we have to. All right, so cannabis is one thing, and I support basically full legalization of that, with the exception it shouldn't be sold to children. But I also support the decriminalisation of all drugs. So that doesn't mean that I support, a free trade in all of those drugs. But what I don't like is people getting criminal sanctions for possession of drugs. I don't think it helps the person taking drugs. I don't think it helps them. I don't think it helps society. It certainly doesn't help taxpayers. I just think it's a total waste. I'd rather any sort of drug use be dealt with in the, people looked after by their families, their community, and the health system, rather than the criminal justice system. I just don't think that it makes any sense whatsoever. I think there's also opportunities for legalization in certain circumstances of other drugs. So we already have opiate replacement programs, such as methadone for people who are addicted to heroin. I've spoken to a lot of health professionals who are keen on the idea of prescribing hydromorphone, which is basically an opiate, prescribing that to heroin addicts as a maintenance thing, so that it takes away their connections to organised crime networks that they need to supply themselves. It takes away a lot of the financial problems that they have in obtaining money. So a lot of heroin addicts resort to petty crime to fund their addiction, and it takes away that as well. And it also takes away the unknowns about what they're actually buying, because it's a pharmaceutical thing. They've done this in other countries. This is not a revolutionary thing. Australia was actually very close to running a trial of this in Canberra back in 2000. Lots of people don't know this. And the research that was done for that has actually been used, I think, in Switzerland and some other places. I think in the UK they did a trial as well. And I'm very open-minded about that. I think it might have some positive benefits. There's also lots of research. I've spoken to people doing research into using other drugs such as psychedelics for psychotherapy use. So there's some work in using psilocybin, which is basically the drug in magic mushrooms, for people in end-of-life psychotherapy. It's quite fascinating research. They're doing trials on that in Victoria, actually. So I think there's opportunities as well to, this is the other thing that Prohibition has done, is it's sort of destroyed a lot of the research that could have happened into some of these drugs, because a lot of them do have potential medical benefits. I mean, cannabis is a really obvious one. They use it for epilepsy and pain relief and all sorts of things now. But there's other drugs as well that we haven't really fully explored their pharmaceutical potential, I don't think. And, it's good to see that some of that research is actually happening. And I'd also like to add that I include vaping in drug law reform. So.
Well, let me tell you, this product right here, I'm importing some of these from China to sell around. This is a disposable vape, but these are actually illegal, right? So what I'm doing here, possession is illegal. When I'm going to sell it to my friends, that's also illegal. And it's
I don't know about the state laws there, but yeah, it's certainly illegal to sell anything with nicotine in it that isn't a approved product. But it's in Victoria. I'm not sure about the laws in New South Wales, but in Victoria, you are allowed to sell vapes. You are allowed to, as long as you're a registered tobacco distributor, which is crazy because they don't actually sell any products that contain nicotine in them. But they can sell vapes, they can sell juice as long as it doesn't contain nicotine, which seems a bit weird to me because that's the whole freaking point. But yeah, so I mean, vaping is another prohibition thing to me. It's the market has come up with an option for people who smoke cigarettes, a different option for them, and yet government stepped in and taken away that option, which I think is wrong, and they should be allowed to have that option. Now, you know, there's questions about whether vaping could cause harm, but really, you know, does it cause more harm than tobacco? Probably not.
I mean, look, this thing with the harm argument as well is like, I can walk into we have alcohol, and I can walk into a bottle shop and buy a bottle of whiskey and drink it, and I'll be dead within 5 minutes. It's like, it's about responsible use as it is, I believe, with a lot of different substances.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people should have choices. You know, I want individuals to have more choices available to them. You know, and if they're addicted to, you know, nicotine in cigarettes, I want them to have all the options available, which includes, you know, vaping or you know, the patches and whatever option is available. I want those options to be available and make those choices.
And definitely, if you're going to consider who's actually going to come up with the best solution in terms of like creating a healthier product, it's definitely going to be the private sector, right? It's not going to be the government who's going to come and, you know, save you with their new like way to get off smoking. It's going to be individual people or companies with a creative mindset who can go and try and create that product to serve that demand. I think that's what we see a lot of the time.
That's definitely the case with vaping. I mean, it's just started off as a small scale sort of experimentation thing, and you know, it grew from there. But it's, you know, it's clearly a good option for lots of people. I personally know dozens of people that have given up cigarettes, and you know, I used to be a smoker myself, and it's a very difficult thing for people to give up, but actually it seems pretty easy to switch from cigarettes to vaping. I know lots of people that have just, you know, they get the packet of cigarettes, they put it down, they pick up the vape, and that's pretty much it. They're good to go, right? Like, it's done. And that's, I don't know, I think part of it is like the public health establishment is very sort of stubborn like this, and in a lot of ways it's sort of embarrassing for them that the market came up with a solution that they didn't come up with, and it's really successful. Like, it's much easier to quit using that than, you know, using some other therapies and some of the other therapies have terrible side effects. You know, like there's some drugs that you can take that apparently reduce your cravings, but then they've got all these other side effects. I think they're like a antidepressant drug. So there's all sorts of other side effects that might not be good. And,
Well, are you? Have you ever read any of Ayn Rand's work?
I have. Yep.
Well, Ayn Rand, I was reading a little while ago. Well, she had all these big ideas, right? As you can tell from reading her books, and she had a lot to write. And obviously, these dialogues which go on for like 50 pages of speeches and stuff. And she found that she couldn't write quick enough. She couldn't concentrate, and so I heard she did a lot of her writing on speed, because she actually realized without speed she couldn't work quick enough. And I just thought that was an interesting point from our friend Ayn Rand, friend of the channel.
Yeah, it used to be pretty common back then. I'm not sure about her usage of it, but I mean, it used to be a pretty common thing. I mean, amphetamines have been around for a long time, and they've been used for all sorts of things. I mean, you know, they used to give them to soldiers. I think they still do. You know, I think the
Vikings definitely did it.
Sorry?
The Vikings did it. They took, I think, amphetamine before they jumped off the boat to go and invade a village, and they were just apparently serious people of all time. Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that, but I'll have to look into that. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, it is. Alrighty. Well, I think that'll do us for today. I really appreciate the talk, David, and I hope we can do it again at some stage. I think it's really good for people to start to get to know some politicians, and I really think it's good to kind of, as much as we are still kind of doing a media thing, trying to like allow politicians to talk directly to the kind of people rather than get filtered through like particularly a mainstream media filter, which often like has agendas and things like that. I think is usually a really helpful exercise. I'll send people, where should people check you out if they want to follow you?
Yeah, so look, I'm on Facebook and Twitter. So if you look at, just do a search for David Limbrick on Facebook or Twitter, you should find me. Maybe you can put a link in or something.
We'll put all the links in the description.
Yeah, but I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and I've started doing a lot of live streams and things like that. I mean, for the exact reasons that you say, especially during this pandemic, it's a really good way of staying, you know, because normally politicians go out and meet lots of people, right? And you can't do that at the moment. So if you give them an opportunity to come to you, that's good. And, you know, people ask some interesting questions. So, yeah, and we'll be doing another one on Sunday, I think, with some of the other guys. So,
all right, awesome. Well, we'll try and send this video out. I'm actually using my brother's laptop because I broke my laptop with a few people's interviews on it there. Hopefully that can actually work itself out. But anyway, look forward to following you, seeing how you go. I really enjoyed talking to you.
yeah, likewise.
And hopefully we can do this again in kind of a few months or a year and see kind of where you're up to and what the Lib Dems are doing in the government. That's it from me. If you like these interviews to the audience, make sure to like and subscribe, comment, share them with your friends to know where the real news is coming from. Hey mum, but other than that, that's it. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.